Imagine you're getting ready for bed tonight. Like you put on your PJs, brush your teeth, do whatever your bedtime routine is, and you hop into bed. But when you wake up in the morning, something's different. You're in the past. Not like the days of Genghis Khan or something like that, but in your past. It's still you, your bed, your house, but a much younger version of you. You now, knowing everything that's going to happen in your life, have a chance to relive your high school years. How would that change the way you experienced those years? What moments would you cherish and which ones would you skip over? What would you do over again for sure and really savor, and what would you skip? How would that influence the pressures of life and those teenage drama that we all experience at times? For me personally, if I knew where my life was headed, I probably wouldn't have cared so much about grades. If I knew where life was headed, I probably would have cherished those moments with my friends Tim, Mark, Phil, all who I didn't know at the time but would pass away in their 20s and 30s. If I knew then what I know now, I probably would have paid more attention to Jenny Abbott, who later became Jenny Anderson. I probably would have been a little bit nicer. If I had just known, maybe it would have changed nothing in how my life actually turns out, like direction of my life, but it would have changed everything. Now this idea of being able to live the present in light of the future, this, if you consider yourself a follower of Jesus, is not just a thought experiment. We are, at the core, at the most basic, those who follow Jesus are a people of hope. We are a people who are called to step into this present moment like someone who already knows where things are headed. We're a people who know the future, not in some Back to the Future type of who's going to win the Super Bowl or who will be the next president. Nobody knows that. But in the resurrection of Jesus, we have seen the future. Jesus came back and he promised, I'm coming back and I'm going to make all things new. That as he is now resurrected, we will be. That is the promise. We've seen the future. So we know where things are headed. We know that every act done in secret will be revealed. We know that every act of sacrifice and love will be rewarded. We know that the world's pleasures are not truly lasting. We know that independence from God ends horribly wrong. We know that giving away your life is the only way to save your life. We know that you can't take your possessions with you. We know that death is not the end. We know that forever is a long time. We know we are a people called to step into this present moment because we already know where it's headed. But then along came 2020. Along came an election, the threat of another lockdown, and a pandemic that just won't end. And this season of uncertainty, of friends out of work, of people dying just yesterday, I found out that my 98-year-old grandmother tested positive for COVID. In this season of political unrest, of the feeling that it's unsafe to speak your mind about just about anything, as 2020 drags on, it is easy to lose sight of where our lives are headed. It's easy to no longer be a people of hope. It's easy to forget what we once knew to be true. It's easy to let the worries of life, in Jesus' words, choke out our perspective on God, our ability to hear from God, our ability to hope. So this past week I was reading a book by a guy named Parker Palmer, and jury's still out on Palmer. Don't know if I can recommend him or not, but the opening line in his book really caught me. I want you to hear this. He said, "There was a time when farmers on the Great Plains, at the first sign of blizzard, would run a rope from the back door to the barn." Why? Because they had all heard the stories about someone who went out to the barn like they had 1,000 times before. Only this time they got caught in a whiteout, lost sight of the house, and froze to death in their own backyard. Like someone might be crying out for them from the back door, but they can't hear it because of the storm. And they might just be feet from from safety, from warmth, but they die isolated and alone in their own backyard. And I read this, and I thought, that's what 2020 feels like to me. We're overtaken by this storm of COVID, elections, social unrest, lockdowns, unemployment, and it is blinding and it is deafening. We can no longer see our way. Even if someone's crying out for us, we couldn't hear them over just the cacophony of noise coming from the media, from social media, from everything. We are so close, and yet we're isolated. We're in our own backyard, but we're lost. Today, I don't want to pretend like we can somehow solve all these problems, and I don't want to pretend like the storm's not going on. But here's what we can do. We can tie a rope from the back door to the barn. I can put something in your hands that if you don't let go of it, if you just follow this line, if you cling to it, it should lead you home. And in a word, the thing that we're going to talk about today, the thing that I want to put in your hands is this deep, deep Christian word of hope. And I don't mean hope as it's popularly used as like some generally optimistic outlook that things are going to work out for the best, although that's pleasant. I hope you have that. I want to talk about Christian hope today. That because we know where things are headed, we can keep pushing forward even when we can't see the way. That because we know where things are headed, we can keep pushing forward even when we can't hear or see. That's what I want to talk about today. Our text for today is Philippians chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, just 3 verses. It's a short prayer that the Apostle Paul says over the Philippians and over us. And it's 3 of my favorite verses in the whole of Scriptures. If you have a text, I would encourage you to follow along. Here's the context. The book of Philippians, the Apostle Paul, he's in prison. He doesn't know if he's going to live or die. He literally thinks they might kill him. And there, literally in bondage, facing possible execution by the sword, he writes in this book some of the most sincere, most joyful, most painfully beautiful, life-giving, most hopeful words in all of Scriptures. So he has no home. They've ripped him out of his home, but he says, but my citizenship is in heaven. So they threaten to take his life. He says, but to die is gain. They literally take everything he has. He owns nothing at this point. And he says, but I've learned the secret of being content in all circumstances. They crush his spirit, try to crush his spirits. But in prison, he proclaims, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I will say, rejoice. That somehow the Apostle Paul is able to look right past the present hardships and rebelliously claim what he writes in Romans chapter 8. That I consider our present sufferings not worth comparing to the glory that will be revealed. That nothing can steal his joy, nothing can ruin his peace, nothing can diminish his hope. And so from this place in prison of passion and suffering and hope, we read this prayer that he writes for the Philippians. Philippians chapter 1, verse 9. And this is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight, so that you may be able to discern what is best and be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. Now we're going to go back and we're going to take this, unpack this bit by bit here. But before we dive into the details, I want you to see where we're headed. I want you to see what lies at the heart of this prayer, at the heart of this message, at the very center and foundation of this. It is this phrase, the day of Christ. That the apostle wants them and us to experience our present reality in light of that day. The day of Christ, the day of Messiah, the day when every knee will bow and tongue confess, the day when wrongs will be made right, when there will be no more COVID, no more presidential elections, no more social unrest, the day when people from every tribe and tongue and nation will gather together as one family under one name, as one people of God, the day when we'll finally be home, when we'll finally be with God. Now, The Apostle Paul says, here's the rope. Grab a hold of it. Cling to it. Here's how you feel your way home when you can't see the way. It has, verse 9, something to do with this word love. This is my prayer, that your love may abound more and more. He says, in 10,000 years, not much of your life's going to matter. History won't remember you. No one will know your career achievements. Nothing will be left of your house. And in a few generations, chances are even your own family members won't remember your name. But the Apostle Paul says, there is something that will echo in eternity. Your love. So Matthew chapter 22, Mark chapter 12, Jesus teaches that loving God, loving others, is the foundation of who we are, what we do, why we exist. Love is ultimate. It will last. It is the very life of God. It is the very basis of reality. Now, that's the idea that love is what matters. But where this breaks down for us, maybe a little bit, as Americans, is the American usage of the word love. For us, the word love is very elastic. It's like that one-size-fits-all spandex. You can pretty much squeeze anything under it. So I can say, I love a good run, and I love GVF. I love my cell phone, and I love God. I love Thai curries, and I love my wife, right? All of those are fair game in English. But in Greek, you wouldn't use the same word to describe all of these things. In Greek, there are multiple words for love. And here, the Apostle Paul uses the word agape. It has a very specific context and a very specific background. You can't possibly agape curries or a cell phone or a good run. Agape is not primarily a tingly feeling. It is, according to the famous German scholar Warnack, a sober kind of love. So in the scriptures, agape is described as a selfless love, a committed love, a sacrificial love, a love that is long-suffering. This is the love that God shows for the wayward Israelites throughout the Old Testament. Again and again and again, they turn against him, and he still chases after them. He still shows love to them, regardless of how they respond to him. So tingly feelings, they're optional here. You could really not like someone and at the same time agape them. So unlike romantic love, eros, or brotherly love, Philadelphia, these just seem to bubble up to the surface like they're pretty self-evident, but agape tends to be deeper, more hidden. Oftentimes agape can only be truly seen. Get this. Oftentimes agape can only be truly seen when it's tested or pushed, when things become rough, when there's hardship. So it's only when God says to Abram, go sacrifice your son, your only son. It's only when God says that Abram really discovers that he truly agapes God. He truly is going to love him and trust him even with his only son. It's only when Jesus turns to the rich young ruler and says, go, sell everything you have, give it to the poor, then come follow me. It's only at that moment that the rich young ruler realizes that he doesn't really agape Jesus. You see, agape can only truly be seen when it's tested. It shines in hardship. It's most beautiful when things are at its worst. Agape is most revealed when we are most exposed. So a few years ago, I sinned against my wife. And I'm not going to go into any details, but it was bad. I deeply sinned against her. And she looked at me. And she unswervingly looked at my sin like she knew what I had done. And she loved me. It was one of those worst moments of my life. And one of the best moments of my life. It's agape. Not tingly, not romantic, not fun, but it's knowing that someone knows me even in my brokenness and chooses to love me. And that agape is healing, it is powerful, it is profound, and that is why so few of us experience agape with any regularity. because it's risky. Agape is most revealed when you are most exposed, and this is even true for God. So Romans 5:8, we get a picture of God's agape. But God demonstrated his own agape, his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. That God's love is most revealed in Jesus Christ when he is most exposed. He's literally naked, nailed to a cross. And that's the scary part about this kind of love. To love someone with agape means that you might be crucified, means that you might be taken advantage of, that means that you might be wronged, means you might be hurt. In fact, this kind of love, agape, only makes sense when you can look beyond that, when you can see where this is headed. Jesus Christ, his love for us only makes sense that he would die for us when you can see that 3 days later he rose from the dead, that the end is not suffering, it's resurrection. The end is not damnation, it's salvation. So circling back to the Philippians here, the Apostle Paul says this: do you want to know how to step into this uncertain, this painful, this difficult moment? Do you want to know how to be present right now, to live into this moment? He says, you take the risk of sacrificially loving your spouse, your children, your neighbors, those who don't vote like you, those who have different views on things, those who see social issues differently, those who hate you. You love them sacrificially. But love, as great as it is not enough. Love must abound, he says, more and more in knowledge and depth of insight. See, love and knowledge go hand in hand. So a while back, we went to a restaurant, and I was wearing this Phillies t-shirt, and I sit down, and we start to order, and the waitress comes up to me, and she is super excited. She comes up, and she immediately starts pulling down her shirt. We're like, what's going on here? And she was pulling down her shirt to show me she has a tattoo that matches my shirt. She's a Phillies fan too. In fact, she's the biggest Phillies fan in the world. And she just wanted to talk about this. She thought this was the best thing ever, that I had my Phillies shirt on. And I didn't have the heart to tell her that I've never actually watched a Phillies game in my entire life. Like, I couldn't name a single player. So I did what any good pastor would do. I faked it. So I'm like, yeah, the Phillies, they're so great, aren't they? This is so great. Now, if she had followed up and asked me a single question about any game or any player, like, who's your favorite player? I'd be like, Jeter? A-Rod? I don't know. Like, I don't even know any players on the team here. What's my point? If I say I love the Phillies, but don't know anything about the Phillies, I don't really love the Phillies, do I? See, love without knowledge is a mockery. It's empty. It's fake. So what if someone said, I love Jesus, and you're like, that's so great. I love Jesus too. Tell me, what's your favorite teaching that he gives? Or what's your favorite moment? Or what's he doing in your life? Or what's your favorite story about Jesus? Talk to me. What's your favorite thing about Jesus? And if they don't know anything about Jesus, if someone says they love Jesus but don't know anything about him, they don't really love Jesus, do they? Love without knowledge is a mockery. It's empty. It's fake. Now, what I'm not saying here, I'm not saying that being a Christian is just knowing a bunch of stuff about Jesus. Here, the Apostle Paul is referring to a very particular type of knowledge. So we Americans tend to think in objective scientific knowledge, like knowledge that is from a distance. But he's using a term, and the way he's talking about this is referring to a subjective or personal way of knowing something. It's the difference, Jonathan Edwards, the famous theologian, says, it's the difference between knowing that honey is sweet, like you might know the chemical structure of honey, and actually tasting a spoonful of honey. Both can be true. Like, you can know objectively that it's sweet, but tasting it, that's a whole different way of knowing it. The Apostle Paul here is referring to that personal, subjective way of knowing. You see, the Apostle Paul seems to think that it's possible to know tons of things about God and not know God. He seems to think that you can know a lot of stuff about someone and not really know that person. But agape, love, calls us to personally know those we claim to love, to personally know the God that we claim to love. That when you know the real me, sinfulness at all, and you choose to love me anyways, and when I know the real you and choose to love you anyways, this becomes the rope that leads us home when we can't see in front of us. This is the thing that pulls us through our present circumstances when they are hard and difficult. This is the hope, this is the joy, this is the peace that we pull on in these times when we can't see where things are headed. So why would we take the risk to love each other this way? He then spells this out in verse 10. We do this. We love sacrificially. We share ourselves. We know each other deeply. Why? So that you may be able to discern what is best and may be pure and blameless for the day of Christ, filled with the fruit of righteousness that comes through Jesus Christ to the glory and praise of God. Why do we do this? Why would we take the risk to sacrificially love one another, to share ourselves, to let ourselves be exposed and be known that deeply? He says, so that you will discern what is best, so that you can find your way when you're lost in the storm, so that you will see this life as it truly is, about knowing and being known, so that you will measure life according to its true weight, not your possessions, not your experiences, not your position, but in love. So that you'll see your marriage, your kids, your house, your job, COVID, elections, social unrest, everything in front of us in 2020, that we will see that in light of where things are headed, the day of Christ. So that your life will be filled with peace that this world cannot steal from you, joy that circumstances cannot ruin, and a hope that cannot be diminished. So here's what, if I were to summarize this prayer, here's what I think the Apostle Paul is saying to us. He's showing us a picture of the day of Christ Jesus and how if we live sacrificially in love, knowing and being known, all these things that 2020 can't take away from us. And he's calling us to cling to hope. Cling to what's right in front of you. Sacrificially love the people right in front of you. Seek to know them and be known by them. Take the risk to love. Why? Because you know how all this is going to work out on the day of Christ Jesus. Because you know what's going to happen. Even if you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, even if you don't know who the president's going to be, you know what's coming. The day of Christ. Live now in light of that. Do this, and you'll make your way home. Let go of this, and you may just lose your way. That's what the Apostle Paul is saying to us. So a bit of practical advice, like how do we cling to hope in the midst of the chaos that is 2020? A couple things that have helped me over the past few months. One is what I talked about in the beginning, that idea of imagining your future self in your present reality. When I feel like I'm losing my way, when I start feeling isolated or hopeless or just overwhelmed, I try to imagine, picture this, I try to imagine myself sitting there as a 90-year-old man, and then from that perspective, coming back and experiencing my current moment, my current struggles, my current day, my current week. Like if I had the chance as a 90-year-old man to go back and relive this very moment, what would I linger over? What would I worry about? What would I not be worried about? It's a simple exercise, but for me at least, it has a profoundly different impact on how I view things that I'm tempted to completely overlook and ignore, like a meal with my family, a walk with my wife, a chance to play with my kids, a chance to just run into a neighbor, someone that I might be annoyed by. All of these things that I would probably just push off in my normal life. When I sit there and think about how I want to view that as a 90-year-old on my deathbed, well, suddenly these things become important to me. Suddenly those moments become cherished, something to linger over. And the things that had been consuming me, things about election results or media, social media, or spiking COVID numbers, or my inability to control or plan anything this year, suddenly I can let go of these. Suddenly they don't seem so important. Maybe you'll find that helpful too. Another practical bit of advice on how to get perspective in the midst of this is Psalm 90. Psalm 90 is a prayer of Moses about life, and it's not real chipper. Doesn't read real happy, but what it does do is, to quote Psalm 90, Moses, he says, "Teach us to number our days." Teach us to number our days. It gives you perspective on what you're going through right now in light of your whole life and in light of eternity, to realize how short these days are and how long eternity is. So one of our elders actually did this in a very, very practical way, which I thought was interesting. He literally numbered all the days of his life to assume that he was going to live to 90 or something, 95, and he literally created a spreadsheet so that he could number his days and mark them off. Now this might seem terrible and morbid to you, but I actually thought this was really, really helpful. That each day, your problems on that particular day, suddenly he had a visual way of putting that in perspective of his whole life. Maybe that's for you, maybe that's not, but I would encourage you this week, reflect on Psalm 90 and find a way to put your life in perspective of the day of Christ Jesus. Church, I'm praying for you. I know this is a difficult time. Next week, we're going to start a new series, and hopefully that'll give a little bit of energy and new life to you. Until then, go in the confidence that God knows everything about you, and he loves you completely.